We think we have seen incredible changes since 1950. For those alive in the last quarter of the 19th century and first quarter of the 20th century, the pace of change must have felt just as stupendous. Before the Civil War, Sunapee was a somewhat struggling farm community. In the 1780s, early in the days of the new state, Sunapee had to ask for tax abatement, the stated reason being too much water, or not enough farmland to raise the crops or livestock sufficient to pay the taxes. That water, the beautiful lake that we all enjoy, and the Sugar River flowing from it, was to be the town's salvation. But we needed the train to bring tourists and to take goods to market. During the 1840s and 50s, train tracks were being laid across New Hampshire, fanning out from hubs at Manchester and Concord. Many small companies were involved, and several vied for the privilege of building the line west to Claremont. On this map, Concord, represented by the letter C, is at the right-hand edge, and Claremont is on the upper left. The Kentucky Valley Railroad, the Kentucky River Railroad, the Sugar River Railroad, the Northern Railroad, the New Hampshire Central, the Merrimack and Connecticut Rivers Railroad, and the Concord and Claremont all played a part before the Concord and Claremont was acquired by the Boston and Maine in 1887 and became the Concord and Claremont Division of the Boston and Maine. In addition, railroad construction faced some opposition because of controversy over eminent domain being used to acquire land for the tracks and the barriers to both animal and human movement presented by the tracks. In 1848, the Concord and Claremont Railroad was incorporated and chartered to build the line from Concord to Windsor, Vermont. By 1849, the line was completed from Concord to Warner and on to Bradford several months later. The effort stalled there, and passengers coming to Sunapee had to catch a coach for the remainder of their journey. The Sugar River Railroad was incorporated in 1855 and chartered to extend the line to Claremont. Several difficulties got in the way, however. Financial, because the fragile economy meant that the towns along the route couldn't help pay for construction. Political, mostly in the form of the Civil War. And technological, the pile of granite that lay between South Newbury and Newbury Harbor required new tools for excavation. Following the Civil War, interest in the railroad was at fever pitch across the country, and the triumph of 1869 was completion of the first transcontinental railroad. On the local level, Sunapee's manufacturers needed a better way to get their goods to market, and after much discussion of whether to support construction if the line was not going to come to the center of town, the people finally voted in January 1869 to pay 3% of the value of the town to help build it through the southwest corner of Sunapee. The investment would be secured by stock. The proposed rail route between Bradford and Newbury Harbor was surveyed in May of 1869. Here you can see the route coming up from Bradford to the southern end of Lake Sunapee at Newbury and along the western shore before heading west between Mount Sunapee and Mountain View Lake to Wendell at the western edge of Sunapee and on to Newport. Work on this segment of the Sugar River Railroad began a year later, employing 125 men, 45 horses and carts, and 12 teams of oxen. The main task was to excavate a cut in the rock, the famous Newbury Cut, 52 feet deep and 300 feet in length. In the fall of 1870, 2 steam drills were added to hasten the job. They could drill holes 9 feet deep and 2½ inches wide in 50 minutes. With the help of the drills, progress picked up. work continued through the winter. By April of 1871, the contractor in charge of the excavation had quit with the job 80% completed. But work continued, and by June they were laying rails while blasting continued day and night at the summit, or the Newbury Harbor end. Rail traffic from Concord to Newbury finally began in September of 1871, to Newport by November of that year, and through to Claremont in September 1872 to much celebration. The press reported, "Scores of Newbury residents gathered at the town's 2 railroad depots to cheer the first run of a through train between Concord and Claremont. The packed coaches were bedecked with bunting, and the train stopped at both Newbury Harbor and Edgemont to take on passengers for Claremont." In 1873, the Sugar River Railroad was absorbed by the Concord and Claremont Railroad, and that subsequently became a division of the Boston and Maine Railroad. Train travel was not without its peril. Trains derailed several times in the early years, often because of drifting snow. This picture shows an early snowplow leading a train. Usually, the plow required several engines and high speeds to remove the snow from the track. If the snow was packed or frozen, manual labor might still be needed. In February of 1873, the Friday afternoon train, filled with the weekend crowd and sporting a plow and 3 engines, left Concord in a snowstorm and got to Bradford by 10 p.m. There, most of the passengers debarked to find lodging, but 18 men continued on the train. The train bucked ever deeper drifts as it climbed toward Newbury and was finally stopped by the snow. After spending the rest of the night there, the train spent Saturday backing down to Bradford, with the crew shoveling as it went. And in March of 1887, on a steep descent just below Newbury Cut, the morning train encountered a deep drift of snow so compact that the engine climbed it, toppled down the bank, and rolled some 20 to 30 feet. Miraculously, no one was injured. Here's a photo of a train in snowy Wendell Flats, with the plow, 4 engines, and a mix of freight and passenger cars, as well as a caboose. Perhaps the most spectacular and tragic accident occurred in April 1922, when the track alongside the lake was undermined by a washout. Several cars derailed, and the engine toppled down the embankment, killing 3 people, the engineer, the fireman, and lead-end brakeman, and injuring 2. Other accidents happened too. For instance, in October 1917, the 2 o'clock train ran over and killed a cow owned by Mr. Perkins of Mount Sunapee. Once the train began arriving at Newbury, summer visitors needed onward transportation. In 1876, early tourism advocate Nathaniel S. Gardner built the 15-passenger Pennacook, but soon sold it to Nathan Young, who remodeled it and renamed it Mountain Maid. The steamboat era on Lake Sunapee began in earnest in 1876 when the Woodson brothers, Dan, Frank, and Clarence, came to town. Here Dan is seated second from the left and Frank is second from the right. They immediately saw an opportunity and built the Lady Woodson, a 48-foot craft that carried 75 passengers and trailed a barge for freight. The success of the Woodson's venture was not immediately assured, however, especially when the Lady Woodson's boiler exploded in August of 1877 and killed youngest brother Clarence, then just 21. But with the help of the railroad, whose summer passengers relied on the steamboat to get to their hotels, Lady Woodson was rebuilt and put back into service. Tourist travel increased steadily, and more steamers were added for special excursions, as well as simply to get visitors to and from their hotels. The press reported events like these or advertised them. In July 1877, there were 10 passenger cars filled with Sabbath school children accompanied by a brass band. In August 1877, reduced fares for those attending a temperance meeting at Blodgett's Landing. In September 1882, an estimated 2,500 attended a Grand Army of the Republic encampment at Blodgett's Landing. In August 1883, 20 bands coming to Blodgett's, railroad and steamers, half price. In the summer of 1886 and 87, there were special Sunday trains coming from both directions with reduced fares. In 1887 and 1888, spiritualist meetings at Blodgett's attracted crowds estimated at 5,000, many coming by train and steamer. Spiritualist meetings continued at Blodgett's from the early 1880s through the 1930s. The Saturday morning train from Claremont carried visitors who had come on the overnight train from New York and sometimes had to pause at the rise between Edgemont and Lake Station to build up more steam. Passengers would get off the train to pick wildflowers or blueberries, piling back onto the train when the whistle blew, so the train could ease over the hill and down to the station. A syndicate of businessmen from Newport and Sunapee built a competitor boat in 1885, the 85-foot, 400-passenger Edmund Burke. The Burke's is a hard luck story. She developed leaks, ran aground, and sank several times. By 1891, she had been renamed Winona, but her luck never changed. Her later owner, George Blodgett, is reported to have said that he'd fix the leak and get her running if only he could stop pumping her bilge long enough. She finally sank tied up at Blodgett's Wharf and burned to the waterline in 1908. Not to be outdone, the Woodson brothers built the 101-foot, 600-passenger Armenia White, their first steel-hulled boat and flagship of their line from 1887 until 1917, when a boat her size was no longer needed and no longer economical to run on coal nor to convert to diesel fuel. The Armenia White was joined in 1897 by the sprightly 72-foot, 250-passenger Kearsarge. In 1902, by the 54-foot, 125-passenger Weetamo, and in 1907 by 55-foot, 150-passenger Ascutney. All of the Woodson's boats had coal-fired boilers, Kearsarge burning a ton of coal per day. Ultimately, Kearsarge and Ascutney were converted to petroleum. For some 30 years, from 1887 to 1917, these boats plied the lake from April to October, carrying passengers and freight to and from the railroad station, first in Newbury Harbor and then for more space and deeper water at Sunapee Lake Station, which was near Davis Cabins. Weetamo continued in use into the 1920s and Ascutney and Kearsarge into the 1930s. They also provided moonlight cruises with an orchestra on board for dancing, ferried passengers around the lake, met the train for onward travel to Newport for concerts or church services, collected freight, and more. During the 1888 season, the three boats then on the lake sold 15,000 tickets. Frank and Dan made improvements along the way and are credited with the invention of an engine control mechanism. The Boston and Maine worked with the Woodson Steamboat Company to promote Lake Sunapee as a tourist spot, perfect for escaping city heat in Boston or New York. Tickets could be purchased in either city that included the steamboat leg of the journey and would get its bearer all the way to his or her hotel. Everett Davis of the Davis Cabins Davis family used this kiosk for steamboat tickets while serving as ticketmaster at Lake Sunapee Station. It is now part of the Sunapee Historical Society's collection, a gift from his family. 4 stations served the Sunapee area. First on the lake was the Newbury Station. The Concord and Claremont Railroad built a new wharf at Newbury in 1884 to accommodate the increase in train and steamboat travel. That turned out to be an interim fix. In this overhead photo, taken by Babe Sargent in 1948 or 9 and published in Wild Goose Waters from Above, you can see that the northbound train ran behind and beside the building that now houses Bubba's Restaurant and crossed Route 103 to the station. By the time this photo was taken, the steamboat dock was being used by the mailboats. The first Lake Sunapee Station, also known as Sunapee Lake Station or simply Lake Station, was built in 1891 to provide more space and deeper water for the steamboats. It was rebuilt and improved into this larger second version that unfortunately burned to the ground in September of 1908. This third station was built in 1909. In addition to its passenger terminal and freight depot, Lake Station offered a water tank, a coal hopper to resupply the steamboats with their fuel, and a turntable. Mount Sunapee, or Edgemont Station, was located near Mount Sunapee and also sported a water tank and a turntable. The name of the station was changed from Mount Sunapee to Edgemont in 1909 to avoid confusion with the other 2 stations using the name Sunapee, and back to Mount Sunapee in 1949 with the advent of the ski resort. Confusion wasn't over, however. In February of 1950, the Argus ran a story about 3 skiers who got on the train in Concord heading for Mount Sunapee only to end up at the Sunapee Station in Wendell when the train went right by Mount Sunapee. The white building you see here is Perkins Store and Post Office. It originally faced the railroad track and station, but was turned 180 degrees in 1951 to face the improved Route 103, and it remains there just west of the traffic circle. Wendell Station, officially named Sunapee, is the only one of the 4 within the boundaries of the town of Sunapee. With 2 other stations using the name Sunapee, it's no wonder that it was more commonly known as the Wendell Station after that part of town. Of the 4 stations, this one and Newbury remain and are used for municipal or commercial purposes. Of course, all those people needed places to stay, and hotels, some grand, some not so grand, sprang up around the lake. Johnson's Sunapee Mountain House was built in 1873, but was destroyed by fire and not rebuilt in 1875. Lakeview House, built in 1875, was the first one near the lake. Later, it was expanded and renamed the Brookhaven Hotel. Runnels House was built about 1878 in Sunapee Harbor, right about where the bandstand is now. It was converted and expanded to the Benmere Inn in 1890. Harborview, known briefly as the Guelma, and finally the Harbor House Hotel, or simply Harbor Hotel, was built circa 1888. It was expanded in 1890, and a stable, now known as the Livery, was built. The Grand Leadon was first a small hotel built around 1900 by the Covell sisters, who had purchased the property in 1896. It was greatly expanded into the elegant Grand Leadon Hotel in 1906 and offered all sorts of summer activities. And in George's Mills, there was Pleasant Home, which was later known as the Grandview Hotel and then Conrad Manor, the Outlook, and Elm Lodge. And on the eastern side of the lake, there was Lakeside Lodge in Herrick Cove and Sunapee Park Lodge, perched above the beautiful beach. Indian Cave Lodge opened in Sunapee Harbor in 1924. And many more. Some people camped for years on their lakeshore property before building a cottage, and those coming for spiritualist meetings at Blodgett's Landing stayed in platform tents there. That accounts for the reason the cottages that were eventually built at Blodgett's were positioned so close together. Obviously, building the railroad and providing food and lodging to all those visitors meant many welcome employment opportunities. At the same time, industry was expanding in Sunapee thanks to water power provided by the Sugar River and the improved means of sending goods to market. The Sunapee Hame Works was the largest employer at the time. It had begun as the Granite Hame Works in the late 1860s and gradually expanded until it was producing 500 pairs of hames, an integral part of workhorse harnesses, per day by 1892. They were shipped all over the country and also overseas, undoubtedly leaving Sunapee by train. Many other businesses, a tannery, a shoe peg factory, a clothespin manufacturer, an Excelsior plant, a rake and crutch factory, sawmill, and many more lined the banks of the Sugar River and must have used the railroad extensively. Here we see a load of rakes ready to meet the train at Wendell Depot in 1946. Production at the Perkins and Alexander Rake Shop in 1883 was 1,500 dozen common hay rakes and 60 dozen drag rakes. The train also assisted by transporting raw materials, everything from ice for hotels in Boston to granite slabs, and perhaps also some of the elegant carved granite monuments, such as the Civil War Memorial for Cornish that was produced in Sunapee. Farm goods also must have gone by train. As early as 1873, a newspaper reported that Jeremiah Morse of Newbury has sent 3,000 dozen eggs to Manchester by rail in a month, and not 1 dozen has been broken. And that's to say nothing of personal travel. The train afforded easy travel to Boston and New York, as well as more locally. In an article published by Sunapee magazine in the summer of 2019, we learned that Dorothy Gove Sawyer remembered catching the train at Edgemont Station near her home to go to Warner to attend the Simons Free High School. Frank Woodsum predicted the end of the era when he first spotted an automobile at Sunapee Harbor, and steamboat traffic gradually wound down from 1917 on. Lady Woodsum had stopped running in 1912. Armenia White was tied up in George's Mills in 1917 and remained there for some years before being sold for scrap. Weedamo was scuttled in the lake in 1926, and Kearsarge and Ascutney left service in 1932 and were ultimately scrapped. So business was good for several decades, but train travel gradually dropped off, with passenger traffic turning more and more to the automobile and the heaviest traffic confined to the summer months. The train was no longer profitable. Lake Station was sold and torn down in 1934, and passenger service was discontinued in 1955. The Concord and Claremont line was gradually abandoned from east to west beginning in 1960, the 16 miles or so from Bradford to Newport in 1964. In many places, you can still see where the train ran, though the tracks are long gone. In a brief postscript, an excursion steam train ran briefly from Bradford to Sunopee during the summer of 1961. It was the pet project of Nelson Blount, shown here that summer with his son, and was the beginning of Steamtown, USA, now located in Scranton, Pennsylvania. This clip shows you what the train was like as it ran along the lake shore, often between the cottages and the shore. The trains, steamboats, and nearly all of the hotels may be gone now, but they all facilitated an era of appreciation for the beauty of Sunapee that lives on in the descendants of those who were introduced to the area many years ago.